Hello and welcome to the 7th video in the series Educational Videos for Novice Java Programmers. This video will be our first look at debugging. Debugging is a term used to describe the technique of identifying and removing errors from a piece of software. So in this video, it's going to be done slightly differently from the rest of the series. Before, we've looked at the errors that novices tend to make when programming. Now in this video, I'm going to teach you some new basic debugging techniques. Looking at literature on the education of Java programming, there is a clear lack of understanding that students have on how to debug their code. Most of the emphasis is on the teaching quality of code and different features of the Java language, but there is often very little on how to fix bugs in the code. For this reason, it is important for you as a novice to learn some of the different debugging techniques that are available. It has been seen in research that students who know how to debug often score higher on their programming tests. So debugging generally has two phases: locating the error itself and then fixing the error. It can often be seen that locating the problem in code is more difficult than fixing it. And for this reason, this video will aim to show you two basic techniques that you can use to help locate an error in your code. The first debugging technique that I will show you will be how to use print statements to check for code execution, or how to check the state of a variable at a given time. The next technique will be using comments to choose which code will be executed and therefore help isolate the problem. So that is what this video is going to cover. So now let's move over to IntelliJ to have a look at the first one. So now it's time to have a look at the first debugging technique that I wanted to show you, which was how to use print statements to either check code execution or check the state of a variable. The way in which I'm going to show you the first print statement technique is with this method down here, called compare student modules. This method will either return a string, false or true, whether or not two students contain the same module. So it takes in these three parameters here, two ints, which are the IDs of two students, and a string based on the module name. So it returns these students here. It checks whether the string is empty. It checks whether these students are not null, and compares the modules and returns true if everything here works properly. So I've called the method up here, and I'll print out the return of this method, giving it the data 1, 3, and maths. So if I run that up here, it prints out false, in which something hasn't worked here because in my head it should have printed out true. So one way we can check to see which bits of the code work and which bits don't is to use print statements. So the first thing I want to check is whether or not the method itself is being called. So if I type system.out.println, and in here you can just type anything that you wanted to print out, so I'm just going to pick test. We can run this, and we can see that it prints out test, which means this method is being called when I want it to, and it is doing something at least. So that's the first thing you want to check, is whether or not it is in fact being called. So if I do Control X to get rid of that, I'm going to place it inside this first if statement. What this will do now is that if this statement is correct, this block of code will be executed and therefore print out this word for us. So if I do that, it still prints the word test. So we can see that this if statement wasn't the problem. This was being executed and it was correct, as I suspected it would be. So it has in fact printed out this statement. So again, if I get rid of that, place it in this statement, and run that, we can see it still prints out test. So again, that isn't the problem. So what we're doing here is going through the program and seeing where the issue could be. So again, I've placed it in this second if statement. I'll run that again. And now we can see it doesn't print out the statement that we wanted to do, which therefore means that this if statement is incorrect. Something here is wrong, which means that this variable does in fact equal null, because that's what we're trying to test here. So if we backtrack here, this is where it's created. We're using the same get statement as the other variable, and that was true. We're giving it these two ID numbers here, and this is where we're giving it the data. And this is when I then realize that I'm giving it the ID number 3, which is not valid. Instead, I should give it number 2. So I then realized that that was where the problem was. So if I run that now, it does print out the word test, but the program itself is still returning false, which means there is another problem somewhere. So if I now put this in the last if statement here and run that, we can see it doesn't print out test. So again, something is wrong with this if statement here. So we can look at this, we can backtrack, and we can work our way back to realize that there is in fact a module called this. That was where the problem was. But there is in fact a module called Java. If I run that now, the test is being printed and the program itself is printing true. So in this instance, it wasn't necessarily the method that was the problem. It was calling the method. I was giving it the wrong data. But using these print statements throughout a method, you would have been able to have seen if there were syntax problems or semantic problems within this method. So that was one way to debug a method, is by checking which of these nested if statements was being executed and seeing where the problem was. The other way to use print statements is to see the state of a variable during execution. So for that, I have made another method down here called always5. And this is a mathematical equation in which it has 4 steps. And when you give it any number, it will apply this equation to it, and it will always return the same number, 5. So this method returns a Boolean, either true or false, if at the last stage here the number equals 5. So we call the method up here, always5, and we give it the number 157 to see whether or not it does in fact always return 5. So I can run that and see that it prints false. So something in here obviously isn't working as it should be. So the next way to use print statements is to check the state of these variables after each of these equations has been carried out on the variable. So after this first step, we are going to type system.out.println, and in here we're going to put this variable into here. So it's going to print out that variable for us so we can see if it's doing what I want it to do. So we can see here it prints out 314, so yes, it has doubled 157 and placed it into temp1, so that isn't the problem. So I'm just going to place some more print statements after all of these expressions, change the variables to always print out each stage of this equation, and then we should be able to run this and see where the problem is. So we can see it's doubled the first number, it's added 10 to it, it's divided by 2, but then here we can see it shoots back up to 319 because it's adding the third and original number together. And this is where it jogs my memory and realizes that this is not how it's meant to go. It is in fact here meant to be a minus, not a plus. So if I run that now, we can see the last state is a number 5 and it returns true because it does equal 5. So by printing out the state of a variable during an execution, you can see how it's being manipulated, how it's being changed. We can see if a variable was null or empty or something like that, or wasn't being manipulated in the way that you thought it was. So although quite a trivial example here, the benefits can still be seen of how to use these print statements. So that is the two ways in which you can use print statements to debug your code. So that's really what I wanted to show you for the first one. So now I can move on to the second debugging technique, which will look at commenting. So now it's time to have a look at the second debugging technique that I wanted to show you, and that's how to use comments to actually debug your code. So a comment you may have come across before is something used to tell the compiler to ignore something. So it's usually used to just add like some English language here that isn't actually Java code. So the first type of comment you can see here is a double /, which means anything on this line won't be executed. And you can obviously use this comment actually in front of a piece of code to tell the compiler to ignore it. So although that was a piece of Java code, we've now told the compiler to ignore it by placing the double / in front of it. So if I run that now, we can see it prints out all of the numbers from 2 to 10, but not the first one because we've added this comment in front of it. So how you can use comments to actually debug your code is you can apply comments to multiple lines of code so that they won't be executed. So therefore you can just run individual lines of code to test whether or not they work. So for example, I want to comment out these 4 lines. So I can highlight them and use Control / and then comment out a block of code. I can run this and I can see it's printed out the first one but not the next 4. So obviously this is quite a trivial example because I can see that all of these will work. But if you say these print statements were objects or required a returned value or something, you may not know which would work and which wouldn't work. So therefore you can comment out most of them, uncomment them line by line, execute them as individual lines and check which ones work and which ones don't work. And again, you can use it as a block to uncomment by doing the same key press as before, Control /. So that's one style of comment. There's another style here which uses a /*. The same thing as before. This is a type of comment which is used to tell the compiler to ignore something, but instead it ignores things over multiple lines. As you can see here, it's just you can use it over multiple lines as long as there's this last and first forward brace. And as before, you can do this to multiple lines, but in this time instead pressing Control //. And here you can see it's commented out that block of code. So these are the two ways in which you can use comments on your code to debug them. There is in fact a third style of commenting here, which uses the /$ This is a slightly different version of commenting. This is used to apply what's called Java doc. Java doc being short for Java documentation, which means this is normally used to provide documentation for a method or to a class. So you can see here it provides this little warning here saying that this type of comment is just freely dangling within this method. It's not being used as documentation for a method or class. Whereas you can see here above this method, we've used it to define what this method does. And you can see here in the controller class, this comment is being used as Java documentation for a class. So this style you should only use to define in standard English the functionality of a method or a class, not used for debugging purposes. That is where you can use these two. So to explain this principle further, I have a statement down here in which it has two students, of which have two different IDs taken from the controller class and assigned locally here. And we're going to print out the first names of each one if these students are different. So if I run this code, we can see it doesn't print out their first names. So therefore there is a problem with this code. So how we can use comments to actually deal with this is to comment out the code that we don't want to execute for now and just individually test lines. So the first thing I want to check is this first if statement. So if I block comment out everything inside of it, but then uncomment the end functionality. So what this is doing is saying that everything inside this if statement be executed, and therefore testing this condition here. But for now, ignore these two first if statements. Obviously we have to also comment out their end brackets because they are in fact a block, and simply execute this middle part. This will test if this works, and it will test if these two do or don't work as well. So if we run this, we can see it's printed out the two different names that we wanted to do. So as it stands, this statement now works as it should be. But I still want these two if statements to be here because I still want to check if the first student does not equal null, the second student does not equal null, and they are in fact different. So now I need to test the other parts of the code. So if I move on to the next if statement, do that, uncomment the middle part, run that. It again prints out the two things, so this if statement isn't the problem. So therefore, just by deduction, you can see that this if statement is the problem. This is the one that's when we don't have this commented and run this, we can therefore see that this if statement is the one causing us the problem. This if statement is not being executed because we know that this code works because we've seen it work outside of this if statement. And therefore we can then see that this is in fact typed wrong. This was a mistake. I was meant to use the does not equal comparison operator instead of the standard comparison operator. And now if we run this, we can see it runs as expected. So that is how you can use commenting to debug the code. So in this video, we've had a look at the two debugging techniques that I wanted to show you. The first debugging technique being using print statements to check which code is being executed or to check the state of a variable as well. The second debugging technique is how to use different types of comments to comment out different pieces of code and execute individual lines of code to check which ones work and which ones don't. So in the next video, we'll be having a look at some more advanced types of debuggings, ones where you can actually use your IDE to help you debug your code. So that's all I wanted to show you today. Thanks very much for watching.